I will present very briefly, actually, it's a short paper which was actually published, which tries to answer the question whether the research innovation policies in the EU after 2008 are a factor of convergence or divergence, whether they are kind of deepening innovation gap or they are reducing it, kind of. So the idea is in more detail whether the crisis had an impact on public funding, whether it has changed policy priorities, and in which direction. So that is the main idea. It's based on a few papers which I did, but what I will try to do very briefly is to highlight this European quite important R&D innovation gap. Very briefly, general points about the crisis, explain what the paper is based on, and just highlight in a punchy way a few key results and conclusions. EU is composed really clearly now of North, South, and East. And South and East are becoming a kind of new periphery. Just a few illustrations which illustrate that, which shows that this is the GERD per capita. Here is the Central Eastern Europe, here is the South, here is the North. Well, obviously this is the kind of clearly, you can see the differences in that respect. If you look at the something which would be considered R&D at the frontier, transnational patents, then this is even stronger gap in terms of North and South and East. If you take science technology papers, which is a kind of science in dual role as a factor of knowledge generation, as an absorptive capacity, gap is not that big, but it's still important. Yeah. And then you also can see that in Europe, there are two structurally different, distinct R&D systems. Well, actually, institutionally, maybe there are three, but in terms of structure, there are two, where you have a North with a large share of business enterprise sector, South and East with much less, where the systems are much more dependent on higher education. Kind of. What is underneath that is actually something which shows clearly the differences in the innovation process, which takes place in the North and South and East. And this is simply taken from the innovation surveys, where you have the shares of expenditures on acquisition of machinery, equipment, and software. This one is the R&D. And what you can see here, that innovation in North is largely about intangibles, while innovation on South and East is largely about machinery. And this is quite simple data, but shows something quite important, which means that the nature of innovation process is different. Therefore, in a sense, the approach and policy should be different. Okay, so that is the highlight, the differences within the Europe. R&D in that context, obviously, is seen as a way to get out of the crisis. But the literature shows that basically R&D is very often pro-cyclical, because the externalities which are intrinsic in R&D are simply too strong for enterprises to overcome them. And then the references here, and Daniela also contributed, shows that we have seen a decline of innovation and R&D activities in Europe. What our paper brings, it brings more kind of differentiated view on that picture. Why? Because we've got a longer time period and we've got much more specific data on policies. The paper is based on EraWatch Trend Chart Inventory Database, which was a project where I was involved extensively for 10 years with a number of national experts which were feeding that database. It was in a complete kind of, I wouldn't say mess, but it was a issue of quality, because you are basically trying to put into statistical framework something which is very difficult to put, policy measures. How are you going to do it? So you have to understand. But nevertheless, a commission that funded Technopolis, and I was kind of assisting them to clean that and to make it finally kind of to conclude what we have learned from 10 years of innovation policy. It seems like 10 days, kind of. So we published it as a big report, and we produced 2 papers, and this is the second paper. I'll refer at the end to the first one. So we classified these instruments into groups. We looked at the number of policy measures and allocated budget. We did comparison between the beginning of the period for which we have data, 2006-8, and 2011-13. And for this paper, because it's simply too much things to clean, we decided to go for 3 groups of countries: Northwest, which is Germany, Denmark, Sweden; Southern Greece, Portugal, Spain; and Central Europe, Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary. Of course, there are lots of weaknesses of this type, but it's a kind of bottom-up, and there is no better data source. So I mean, we can complain, but show me something better. Yeah, so that's my answer usually, kind of. What we have seen, what are the major trends that you have seen? This is not based on database, but it shows you first that in Central Europe you have this, this is the GERD in business per capita, this is government. You see that they're kind of, in that period, there's a slight increase in both of these sub-periods. In Southern Europe, you see that in terms of business enterprise, it remains more the same, and in per capita term has gone down. In Northwest, in developed part, it goes up in both respects. If you look at the shift, changes in relative shift weight of government over business sector, you see a huge drop in Southern Europe, you see increase in the North, and you see a differentiation in the East. These are data based on our Trenchard database, where we show the areas in blue are those where R&D funding has increased in the first period, first 2 years after the crisis. These are the areas where it has decreased, and these are the areas where it has kind of was protected. And what you see in the first 2 years, there was a kind of really an attempt to use R&D as an anti-buffer, you know, as an anti-cyclical device, but then you see that simply it failed. You know, kind of, you see much more areas where R&D funding has decreased. Simply there was a wish and a commitment, but inability of policymakers to maintain that. So then we have austerity logic, which then pervades the Europe. What was the response in terms of policy sources? Because there was this decrease in public funding. Okay, let's try to seek for money from other sources. There is a slight increase in the co-financing by private sector and a bigger increase in co-financing by structural funds, which are actually, not suddenly, but replacing actually national funds, to the point that some of the R&D system are basically run on structural funds in a very perverse way. When you look at the number of measures that we have, what you have here is that the overall number of measures in the database has gone down by 160 measures in period from 2009 to 2013. You see that in Northwest we have 118, goes down to 91, so kind of some consolidation of the measures. We see in Central Europe a slight increase, 90 to 92, and then we have in South basically cull, going from 92 to 51. Simply countries are unable to fund, to maintain the public R&D policy in the same extent as they used to do in the past. What happens in terms of policy areas? These are the 5 groups that we have divided them. This is the Southeast, this is the Central Europe, this is the North, kind of developed part. And what you see here, that if I start from the Central Europe, which is the middle part, you see that basically there is relatively no change. There is some increase in the measures oriented to innovation. When you look at the Northwest, which is this part which is here, you basically see increase in most of the measures. And in South, as you would expect, you see a radical decreases, except trying to do something on the innovation side. So we see differentiated response where North, which is already developed, has stabilized and it kind of has increased. Eastern Europe is maintained because it's using EU structural funds to do that, and South basically goes down. You know. This you can summarize through the table like this, where you have all policy priorities and instruments, and you can simply count which are those where you have a decline in terms of number of measures, where you have a stable situation, and where you have kind of a number of those priorities where you have either increase or decrease. And you can see that in Southern Europe you have a largest number, you have dominant tendency towards decline, stability in Eastern Europe, and growth stability in the North. So in a sense you can conclude from and this is the compensatory feature function of structural funds, which shows you the percentage of structural funds which are buffering the decline in public R&D investment. So this is the share in the total government expenditures. in a sense, conclusion here is, you'll just look at the first line, that R&D policies were unable to contribute to convergence across the EU, but were actually a factor now for the divergence. In the sense that you have a north, further support to innovation activities either stabilized or increased, south, complete collapse, not complete, but collapse of national public support, and its substitution only to some extent by structural funds, simply to preserve them, and on east you have a strong compensatory effect of structural funds. So that's in a nutshell. I want to finish with a kind of important final point, and that is whether these innovation policies, because I showed you before differences, that we have these gaps, whether the innovation policies are actually appropriate to the country's income level and where they are in relation to technology frontier. It's kind of Schumpeterian-Aguillon type of assumption, and we have another paper where we explore exactly that. Whether these policies are Schumpeterian, in the sense whether they're reflecting where the countries are, because you would expect that the innovation policy of Greece should be different than the policy of Germany or of Sweden. So to do that, we kind of did a kind of clustering analysis where we, based on the type of data that we have, we classified them into several criteria, and we try to see whether there is some differentiation which would be based on the income level on a distance to technology frontier. And we had it for two periods, but I'm just showing on one because there is no significant change within these two periods. And what you have here are these type of models which are which you can get kind of according to their proximity or distance. What you can see immediately here, let's say if you look at the group 2, science, collaborative R&D, then Germany and Greece have a more similar innovation policy based on this than the other group. Just to show that we cannot go now into detail. I'll summarize the points from here, but there is a very weak or almost no kind of differentiation of policies which you would expect given where countries are in terms of technology distance. The science collaboration policy mix model is you find in all four groups. This is a specific European feature. This idea, let's stretch into the R&D. We create lots of output through Horizon, but they end up nowhere. They're pilot project, they're demonstration, which rarely get basically adopted. So this is the reflection of that. It is the most common model followed by countries of very different technological levels. And you can see through these plans of valleys in countries which are way behind. So there is unexpectedly high homogeneity of policy mixes despite relatively big differences in countries in terms of technological and economic development. So the conclusion overall that the exclusive focus on policy transfer and diffusion of the best practice is actually precluding a critical understanding of what drives your growth. So my point there will be there's too much kind of transfer of the best practice. Try to see what is in your yard. And my final point will be that the biggest experiment in industrial innovation policy in the world is taking place today before our eyes. This is the EU structural funds through the umbrella of smart specialization. We are not aware of it, but it's the biggest policy experiment. And as a result of that, I couldn't resist not to try to be involved in that because I'm involved kind of like a consultant, but on a more academic side, I've initiated a kind of a project group where we try to look at more critically into smart specialization. First, why to do another book on smart specialization? It's first because of its huge size. Second is the example of something which I call in the book new industrial policy. It's not the only one. It's that there are emergence of such approaches in the world. So I've gathered a group of kind of experts, academics, and we look at the smart specialization in the international context, not just with different EU context, but also within the non-EU context, Kuhn-Lee, Schumpeterian idea. Then you have Justin Yee, Full Lean, New Structural Economics, which is all attempts which this workshop is about. How do you decide where to go and how to go about it? So this is a kind of more systematic attempt to critically examine it because it's too important to be just left outside and not analyze it. Thank you.
Yeah, a couple of questions. One.
Can we go back to your slide where you had the northern countries? You had a graph of the northern countries.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Okay. You mean this one?
The one that Luxembourg is on top. I don't remember which one it was. This one. That's very interesting. One of the things that I don't see here is how many firms have immigrated their headquarters elsewhere. So, for example, the most innovative firms from Greece have gone to Bulgaria, to Luxembourg, where is Fire, and probably patents there. So a lot of the innovation that is from Greece is not really in Greece, is elsewhere for different reasons. Because of institutions. But this is not captured in this kind of data.
No.
And this is very obvious from all your slides elsewhere that concern Greece. The headquarters, I mean, the immigration of the headquarters from Greece is amazing. I mean, the number is
you can try to do the same chart with inventors rather than applicants. So the location of inventors rather than the location of applicants.
Yeah, or the origin of Greece. I don't know. That's one thing. And the other thing is that we talked about Southeast focus on machinery and North on intangibles. Southeast, developed Eastern Europeans, the Southern, the German firms immigrated their manufacturing facilities in Eastern Europe. It's natural that they have machinery innovation patents because it is about adjustment, while their core technologies are left.
Yeah, if I can add to that, this was my kind of comment on the green paper. The only successful story in the Europe, not the only successful, but one of the remarkable successes of Europe in the last 15 years is the kind of German Central European manufacturing miracle. Well, you have integration completely of these countries into industrial system of Germany and Austria. And you can see that here where you have Central Europe versus EU South, and their relationship in relation to global value chains. This is the foreign value added as a share of gross export. You see here on the top, this blue is Central Europe. You see the North Europe. You see Germany and Austria here. You see China. Basically, it's higher than China. And where you have South way behind. So you have a part of Europe which has become part of the industrial networks of the core and managed to get through the crisis, and you have a South which is becoming increasingly isolated. So my policy kind of additions there, which I have in the paper, is simply taking that into account, recognizing also this structural problem within Europe which is emerging, and the idea, which I can elaborate later on if there is a time, of a global value chain oriented industrial policy, which means that if you say in a nutshell on a pub speak, that would be bring Germans back to solve also your problems, because they are also part of the problem, So that's the nutshell. Thank you.